So good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone has its lunch ready for this second of the Bedrocan series, the lunch webinar. This time with Matthijs Bossong, who I'm going to introduce shortly. Some house rules. If you have any questions for me, for Matthijs, or in general, please use the Q&A button, which you can find on the bottom of your screen. So don't use the chat, use the Q&A session. I'll try to mix the questions in during the webinar. If some are left behind, we'll do it at the end. We'll have a separate Q&A session with Matthijs. Before we start, I'd like maybe the ones that have been with us before in the first session, I'd like to know who we have in our house. So maybe you can answer a question. A question will pop up in your screen. So could you please answer the question in the poll that will appear now? And the first one is, what is your knowledge level of medicinal cannabis? So are you an expert? Are you about average, below average, or are you absolutely new to the topic? Please cast your votes. Let's see if we can get the results up. About average. Now we have some experts in the room. That's nice. So Matthijs, that's nice. Let's see if we can get them some more information. And the most are above average. And we have two people absolutely new to the topic. So welcome to us today. And also, we would like to know a little bit where are you from? What is your background with medicinal cannabis? So what is your connection to medicinal cannabis? Are you a healthcare professional? You work at the government? Are you a researcher, business, patient, or something else? Give you a few seconds to cast your vote. Now let's see if we can get the results up. Business is, we have a nice spread over the different fields. We have some patients with us. Business is the winner, but still not more than only 40%. So welcome all. I hope you'll have a nice lunch webinar with us. And this is the second one. If you missed the first one, which was with Renger Witkamp, you can watch it back online. The link is on our website, so please go there if you want to see the first webinar. So let me introduce Matthijs Bossong. Thank you very much for being with us. You're a neuroscientist at the Utrecht University Medical Center, and your specialty is with cannabis and cannabinoids. And you're researching the effects on our brain. Could you please tell us something about yourself?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for the introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. Yes, as I said, my name is Matthijs Bossong. I'm assistant professor at the Department of Psychiatry of the University Medical Center in Utrecht. I have a background in biomedical sciences, particularly in neuroscience and pharmacology. And I've been doing research in the field of psychiatry, brain function, and cannabinoids, well, for about 15 or 16 years now or so. Yep.
So, and in those 15 or 16 years, you've chosen to use cannabis as your main subject, or how do you call it? How come you're so passionate about the product and that particular field of research?
Well, that all started off quite some time ago. I think in the beginning of the first half of the 2000s, the first epidemiological studies came out. So studies that followed large cohorts of people in time. And these studies showed a significant correlation between cannabis use and the later development of a psychotic disorder. And well, by nature, these studies that they show an association between two factors. And it's hard to say anything about causality. And at the time, I worked at the Trimbos Institute in the Netherlands, an addiction research institute. And we said, well, if we can come up with a biological explanation for these two phenomena, for the biological explanation for the relationship between cannabis use and a later development of a psychotic disorder, then that causality may become more plausible. So that's when we started an extensive literature search to try to come up with a hypothesis of how cannabis may be involved or may lead to the development of psychosis. So, and that's how I got introduced into this this fascinating new regulatory neurotransmitter system, the endocannabinoid system. So that's how it all started off.
So that's last time we had Professor Witkamp explaining a little bit more about the receptor system, but that's also the thing that's triggering that it has an effect on our brain. Can you share us a little bit of knowledge on how does that endocannabinoid system work, or how does it work in our brain?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, to answer that question, I wanted to touch upon normal or healthy brain function in short first, and that's what I try to explain in this slide, because everything we do, everything we feel, everything we experience, that is being processed in our brain, and our brain consists of millions of nerve cells, of neurons, and on the left-hand side on top you see a slice of the brain, and I'm going to use a model of the brain that I have, so don't be scared, it's just a plastic model, and I like to use that to explain processes in the brain. So what you see on the slide is a slice like this, and when we zoom in deeper in the brain, you can imagine, you can see that there's millions of brain cells communicating with each other. So when information is processed in the brain, it's actually what it requires is proper communication of neurons, of brain cells, and no two neurons are in direct physical contact with each other, and they process that information, they communicate with each other using chemical substances called neurotransmitters. And that is what you see on the right hand side. The red dots are the neurotransmitters. So the brain cells communicate with each other, but they are not in direct contact. There's a cleft in between two neurons called the synapse, and that information that needs to cross that synapse. So, and that is, so the brain uses neurotransmitters to transfer information from cell A to cell B, and those chemical substances are called neurotransmitters. And well, maybe you're familiar with a few of them. I named there's a couple of examples there on the right hand side: dopamine, glutamate, GABA. So for glutamate is important for learning and memory, is involved in brain development. So they have different functions. And maybe you can see the next slide. So that is examples of certain neurotransmitters that have important roles, functions in our brain. But what is so fascinating about another type of neurotransmitters, so we have glutamate, we have GABA, but there's also another type of neurotransmitters, and that is the cannabinoids. So we have cannabinoids in our brain, in our body, that have an important role in proper brain function. And normally, neurotransmitters, so they cross that synapse to have a certain function. So they are being released in cell A, and they act on cell B, so to say. So they cross that synapse. And the cannabinoids that we have in our brain, you can see that in the right circle. They are located not in cell A, but in cell B. So they act in the opposite direction, or backwards, so to say, if you like. And that is so fascinating about that system. So it is a neurotransmitter system. The cannabinoids that we have in our brain, so it's like cannabinoid substances. You could say we have some kind of cannabis plants in our brains that have a very important function there, but they regulate other neurotransmitters. So perhaps it's comparable. You can say it's like a traffic light. So by acting as a traffic light, that cannabinoid system can control the neurotransmission, the release of other neurotransmitters like glutamate and GABA. So it determines where and when that level of other neurotransmitters should be higher or lower in the brain. I hope that's a bit clear, but it's a fascinating regulating neurotransmitter system in the brain, and it's involved in many brain functions. You can think of cognition, learning, memory, reward processing, mood, relaxation, things like that. So it's present everywhere in the brain, regulating the release, the neurotransmission of substances like glutamate and GABA.
So humans by nature are actually full of cannabinoids already talking to each other in our brain and playing an important role in the brain function.
Yes.
And we have it in ourselves.
Yep.
Yeah. And so and then I can imagine that stuff happens when you put external cannabinoids into that system. Is that true? And that's also what your first study was, right? You started with the effects of THC on our brain. Yeah,
that's right. So during my PhD, I investigated the acute effects of THC on the human brain. So there's cannabinoids in our brain, the endogenous cannabinoids, but there's also more than 100 cannabinoid substances in the plants in cannabis, and the most the main psychoactive component in cannabis is THC, and we administered that to healthy volunteers to look at the effects of cannabis on the brain. Maybe you can see the next slide where I wanted to show how we did that. So we looked at the effect of THC on the brain. So we used the pure compound THC, which was extracted from medicinal cannabis, and we administered it to healthy volunteers using a volcano vaporizer. That's what you see on the left-hand side. And after that, we put the participants in the scanner, and using different scanning techniques, we looked at the acute effects of THC on the brain. And the main hypothesis there was that THC would induce psychotic-like brain function. And basically we had two reasons for that hypothesis. And that is, first, when you look at behavior, the behavioral effects of cannabis, of THC, are a bit psychosis-like. Cannabis can induce slight psychotic-like symptoms as delusions or hallucinations or impaired cognition. It can affect emotion and acute anxiety, things like that. So behaviorally, it's a bit psychosis-like. But there's also, as I explained a couple of minutes ago, there's also that association between cannabis use and the later development of psychosis. That's the two reasons why we expected THC to induce psychosis-like brain function. And what is important to remember from this part is that is what we demonstrated when we gave THC to healthy volunteers, is that we showed that psychosis-like, psychotic-like brain function. And I would like to give one example, and that's when people were in the scanner, we made several scans, and during one of these MRI scans, we asked them to perform a working memory task. You can visualize the brain areas that are involved, that are activated during the performance of this task. And that's what you see on the right-hand side. You see there, areas that light up during the performance of a working memory task. And this is horizontal slices that you see when you look at the brain. That is mainly frontal areas here, and there's also some areas in the parietal cortex that are involved in this specific working memory task. So you can visualize that these areas light up, and then you can examine the effects of THC on this brain activity pattern. And what we saw is that, what we know from previous research is that in psychosis patients, they show inefficient brain function when they perform this working memory task. And what it means is that when you look, there were easy tasks, there were more difficult tasks, and they performed the easy tasks quite well. So there was no difference in task performance with patients in previous research. But what was demonstrated is that that the activity in the frontal areas or in the working memory network was significantly higher during the performance of the easy tasks. So, and we call that an inefficient working memory system. And you can compare that to a car, when you have two cars that travel a certain distance, and the car that uses more petrol for the same distance, that is the inefficient car. And that is the same with psychosis patients. So they perform tasks at a certain level, but at a higher cost. So with more brain activity, with more neural resources. So that is what we know in psychosis patients. And we showed after THC administration to healthy volunteers, we show similar patterns. So we showed this psychotic-like brain function with THC administration.
So actually you can say that THC makes certain parts of your brain function very inefficiently, and that is similar to people with a psychosis that show the same brain activity.
Exactly, and we show that with different techniques, and this is one example of that.
Okay, and I have a question here from Frank Glim. He says, so can I see that the cannabinoids amplify the signals that the body itself is already sending out? And does this amplification, is that true? And does this amplification take place because of more neurotransmitters, or what is exactly the reason behind it?
So there's one thing to mention, I think, is that so when we look at brain activity, it's an indirect measure of what is going on in the brain. We can't say for sure which neurotransmitters are involved. But what we do know is that the two neurotransmitters that are mainly controlled by the endocannabinoid system is glutamate and GABA. So most likely the effect that we see here on the brain is related to an effect on neurotransmission of these two neurotransmitter systems.
Okay. And after that, so you can say THC might cause something like a psychosis or something like, and then after that you shifted your research to CBD to research the same effects. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah. So the main conclusion of my PhD was, okay, so we see psychotic-like brain function here. So my idea then was, okay, so then maybe when we have patients with abnormal brain function, if we treat them or if we give them cannabidiol, CBD, then we may be able to normalize that brain function that is different in patients. So after my PhD, I moved to London and I worked at the Institute of Psychiatry there, and there I was involved in a study with CBD treatment. That was with people who were at high risk of developing psychosis. So they haven't been diagnosed with psychosis, but they are at high risk, which means that they have, well, we call it subthreshold symptoms. So they have, they were somewhat more paranoid, anxious, depressive than others. And a certain proportion, a certain amount of these patients will develop psychosis later on in their life. So you could say it's the phase of the disorder before the onset of psychosis. And then we treated those young individuals with CBD, and we looked at symptoms and we looked at brain function before and after treatment. Well, the two main conclusions there is that when you look at symptoms, the group that was treated with CBD, they showed reduction in their symptoms or in the symptom score. So it could be less severe symptoms or fewer symptoms, but at least there was some beneficial effect on symptoms of these young individuals associated with CBD treatment. And that was when we looked at all the symptoms together. But when we looked more closely at what kind of symptoms were affected the most, then it was the anxiety symptoms, the symptoms of depression, so the negative symptoms, so to say, that were affected most. We saw the strongest effect there of our CBD treatment. And then when you look at brain function, what we expected is, so we know there is increased, well, and in this study, we didn't look at cognitive function, but we looked at the resting state, brain activity, and we know that in certain areas of the brain that are critically involved in psychosis, that there is increased resting state activity. And then it's mainly in the striatum and in the hippocampus that we looked. So the striatum, that is some subcortical areas in the brain. The striatum is here, and the hippocampus is here in the temporal lobe. So the areas that we know that are critically involved in psychosis, we know that there's increased brain activity in those areas. And what we saw with CBD treatment is that there was a normalization, a reduction in brain activity, especially in these areas. It hasn't been published yet, so it's all work in progress. But what we want to look at, of course, is how those two correlate. Is this reduction in symptoms, is that related to normalization of brain function? Mm-hmm. But it is the two main findings from that study that we run in London.
So there are many people saying that CBD is not psychoactive, or how do you call it? But you say, well, CBD does have an effect on your brain.
Yeah, it's a bit of a semantic discussion, but CBD does have psychoactive effects, but it does not have intoxicating effects. So we know that THC is the main psychoactive, and it's the intoxicating ingredient of cannabis. And when you give CBD to healthy controls, they won't experience any intoxicating effects, but it may have therapeutic effects. So that implies that it has a psychoactive effect. It has an effect on the brain.
Mm-hmm. And I have a question here from Frank again. Do you confirm that it is possible to get a psychosis from using medicinal cannabis? Or is it?
Yes, that is possible. So that's the question. So that is the acute effects of cannabis. So people may experience acute psychosis-like effects, and well, that depends on all other kinds of factors. To what extent you experience those effects. When you look at the long-term effects of cannabis, so if the question is, well, does cannabis cause psychosis? Then I always say, well, it's a risk factor in the development of psychosis. And people may be familiar with when you talk about smoking tobacco or eating hamburgers and the later development of cardiovascular problems, then people know what a risk factor is. Some people may smoke tobacco during every day during the whole life, and they won't develop any cardiovascular problems, and others will. So cannabis is a risk factor in the development of psychosis, and there are many more risk factors in the development of psychosis. So some people may develop psychosis, and cannabis may play a role in that development. But there will be other people that may cannabis very frequently on high potency cannabis, and they won't experience any problems. So it's a risk factor. Also genetics play an important role there. And what is important maybe to remember is that the risk is higher when you use cannabis at a younger age, when you use more cannabis and higher potency cannabis. So there are some aspects that are important that are involved in the association.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you're now, well, this was not your final study, so the results of this study will probably be published somewhere in the next year. And is that the idea?
So from this study, so this is work done in London that is going to be published soon, the coming year. And the last 2-3 years we worked on a study in Utrecht with cannabidiol treatment of psychotic patients, and that prepared a slide or showed some information. That is the next slide. Yeah. So the last 3 years in Utrecht, we ran a study with CBD treatment of psychosis patients. So full-blown patients with a diagnosis of psychosis. And we treated them for 4 weeks with CBD daily. And we looked at brain function, at symptoms, at cognitive function. So there were 2 similar study days before and after treatment. So what we know from clinical trials is that CBD may have therapeutic effects, may have antipsychotic effects in these patients. But what we don't know is how that is caused in the brain. What is the underlying neural mechanism that is responsible for these clinical effects, for these effects on symptoms? And that is what we wanted to look at. That was the main research question here. So again, emphasis on brain function. Well, and we go into so this is this study we conducted that over the last 2-3 years. That was finished last year. So we have all the data now. We have all the brain scans, and we are working on data analysis. But we treated 17 patients with CBD and 14 with placebo, and we're going to look at the effects of CBD on the brain of these psychotic patients, and we're going to correlate that with symptoms. So by doing that, we can say, okay, the effects that we see on the brain, are these related to the improvement in symptoms that we see in these patients?
And there's also a question, are you broadening your research? I understood you were also part of a large new international study. Can you share a little about that?
Yeah, so there's a lot going on in this field, well, most of researchers will conclude their talks with that there's more research needed, and of course that's what I do too. But actually, that is what is going to happen. So I usually say there's more trials needed, there's more evidence needed to investigate, more studies needed to investigate the potential of CBD as a new antipsychotic treatment. And there's going to be a large international multi-center study that's going to start after the summer, being coordinated from London, and in total, so that's going to include in total 250 psychosis patients and 500 young individuals at a clinical high risk for the development of psychosis. And they are going to be treated with cannabidiol or placebo for a long time. For the at-risk individuals, that is 2 years of treatment, to thoroughly examine the effect of CBD treatment on symptoms, on brain function, on potential biomarkers, things like that. So there's going to be a very large international studies with all the groups working on this in the whole world involved.
And in the end, what do you, because a researcher always has a goal, what would your dream or your goal be with your research? What do you want to add?
That's a good question. As you notice, I'm so fascinated about this topic. So what we know is that, for example, in psychosis patients, they have abnormalities in the functioning of the endocannabinoid system. So what I would like to show is, what I would like to achieve is how we could normalize their brain function. Yeah, that's what. So that we could demonstrate actually what is going on in the brain. So for example, they have higher cannabinoid receptors in certain brain areas that you could say, well, we act on these receptors in these areas, and that correlates to an improvement in symptoms. And that would be fantastic. That you could, or maybe try. And another where you could think is that, well, there's so many compounds in the cannabis plant. Maybe there's other cannabis compounds that we could use to treat these patients. So there's so many possibilities with cannabinoids and with medicinal cannabis in the field of psychiatry that we could look at.
Well, thank you very much, Matthijs, for sharing. We already ran out of the half hour. I have two very short questions left. I think you can answer them very quickly. The first one, in your slide on the CBD study, it says 600 milligrams per dose for the CBD study. What was the milligrams or micrograms? I don't know, for the THC study.
For the THC study, we used in two different studies, we used 6 to 8 milligrams of THC. So in a volcano vaporizer, and that is comparable to a standard joint dose. That's what it was based on.
And also a question from Noel. He said, actually, his question is, are you using the product from Bedrocan? But actually, you were using how do you call it? The extracted, the purified CBD and THC. You were not using the full spectrum, right?
Yeah, that's right. So the THC that was extracted from the medicinal cannabis, the pure THC, and with CBD, this was CBD capsules, and those were manufactured, well, for the sake of our research.
Yeah. And I have a question from Walter Goede. Is there also research about microdosing THC cannabis?
Yes, there is, but I'm not too familiar with that actually.
Okay.
Yeah, but you can find, there is something going on there, yes.
But you're not doing research on microdosing?
No.
No. Okay, then I have, the questions are gone. Thank you very much. We're also out of time, so we did it in half an hour. Thank you very much, Matthijs. I hope this, and I hope you shared some new information for our guests. I also had a question before, will this be shown online? Yes, this webinar, you can view it back online. We'll post, everyone will get a link. So if you were not able, well, you are able, but if some of your colleagues were not able to join, they can watch. We are preparing the next Bedrocan series. It will happen after summer. You'll get an invite from our next guest. It's not known yet who it will be. Matthijs, thank you very much for your knowledge, for your research. Is there anything you'd like to say as a final word to our viewers?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the attention. Thank you for the invitation, and it was an absolute pleasure.
Thank you very much. I wish you all a very pleasant day wherever you are in the world, and hope to see you in the next version of in the next session of Bedrocan. Thank you very much. Bye bye.